Asile, Tropical Island Survival, Week 9, Day 1. In the morning, after my morning chores, I pulled my mattress from the dirt mold and inspected it. Fortunately, it didn't rain. I noticed how the bottom of it was more solid and contiguous than the top, probably due to the fluffier foam floating to the top, while the less fluffed material sank to the bottom. Even so, it wasn't much, and I was pretty pleased with it for the most part. The only problem, really, was the strong rubber smell to it. So once I'm certain it's set, I'll wash it with a little water and soap, perfumed with island flowers, and leave it out in the sun for the day. Hopefully the heat will help evaporate the smell out of it. After that, I took some time to think about what I wanted to do with myself this week, and I thought that the next major project needed to be getting myself a better source of clothing, which meant experimenting with different fibers today. So I spent some time collecting different plants, particularly harakeke, since I knew it could be broken down into fibers, along with more beach sand to cook into alkali for softening it if I had to. I spent some time practicing removing the fibers from the harakeke to make flax, and while the fibers were strong and relatively soft, it just took way too long, and I couldn't think of a way to mechanize the process to make it practical. I stepped back for a moment to think about what I knew about various cloths and fibers, many of which are made from plant fibers like cotton, animal fibers like wool or even silk, or synthetic fibers like nylon or polyester. All I had to work with were plant fibers, and the only ones I knew of were cotton, linen, which is made from the aforementioned flax, and the bark paper made by the native Polynesians and is a bit unusual. Then it occurred to me while looking at the grindstone I've been using to make paper, that since my pulp paper is basically the same thing as the bark paper, and even cotton, namely cellulose, maybe I could draw cellulose pulp into fibers. After all, I'd heard of companies recently weaving bamboo fibers into clothing in a similar way. So I took some time to grind down a batch of paper early, and used my alkali solution to break it down while I ate my lunch. Next, I needed to come up with a way to draw or pull it into fibers. I tried using a stick on the end of my drill press to twirl the cellulose into yarn, but it was too mushy. In a strong enough alkali solution, it's practically a liquid. Thinking about the cotton I wanted to recreate reminded me of cotton candy, and I wondered if maybe I could spin the liquid cellulose the same way. My understanding is that a cotton candy machine works by melting sugar and then squirting it out through a narrow spinning nozzle, so I took a moment to try and replicate that mechanism, using a couple of bamboo cups, which I then carved some very small holes into and mounted onto the end of my drill press, able to rotate freely like a centrifuge. I put a large pot around this mechanism to keep any cellulose goo from flying across the shop. I turned it on and the results were promising. The fibers produced were a bit soggy, weak, and coarse, but I think that they might dry if I could get some air moving through the system, again like a cotton candy machine, as well as if I could make the fibers thinner. With that information, I decided to move on to building a more dedicated mechanism. First, I got some clay and threw some small pots to function as the cellulose spinner drum, as well as a hopper for pouring the stuff in continuously as it's produced on the grindstone underneath it, so I can run both mechanisms at once. This required me to additionally make some small clay wheels that could transform the slow rotation of the grindstones into a fast rotation on the drum. Unfortunately, I soon realized that this mechanism would also be in the way of me feeding material into the grindstones, which were also fed from the center. I had to stop and scratch my head for a moment before realizing the simple solution was to put the spinner underneath the grindstones and let the cellulose drip into the spinner as it's produced, in addition to pouring alkali into the cellulose as it's being ground. This should work because the cellulose fibers won't be able to escape the spinner until the alkali finishes breaking them down into components small enough to fit through the holes in the spinner. I spent at least an hour carefully designing and building these clay components, including a bowl to catch the fibers produced, before leaving them out to dry in what was left of the afternoon sun. I'll have to finish drying them near the fire this evening. In the meantime, I worked on making a sieve to control the size of the extruded cellulose fibers. I basically wove a mesh out of bamboo cord, which was stiff and strong, and had tiny holes in it for the cellulose to squirt through as it was produced. I had to make a small bamboo frame work on this, which was extremely tedious and time-consuming, but it was effectively a loom, and got me thinking about how I'll need to make textiles once I have fibers to spin. Something for the back burner. For the moment, however, I attached the piece of mesh to the centrifuge cup I had, and confirmed its effectiveness at making fibers, producing a cottony fluff when fully dried. I was getting very excited about this development, and next needed to figure out how to turn it into fibers like string or yarn. My rope twining tool wouldn't work for that because the cotton wasn't in thread form yet. As I started playing with the fluff, however, I found it wasn't hard to get it to twist in the thread. In fact, a lot of it got twisted onto the rotating shaft of the drill press. This gave me an idea for further automating the process, and since the lathe was right next to the drill press, I decided to turn it into a sort of spinning wheel. I turned some bamboo to make a spool for the string, but I quickly found it wasn't enough to just twirl it onto the spool. It needed to be twisted along as it went, again, like rope. So I got a few more pieces of bamboo and built an arm mechanism onto the spool that was kind of like the reel on a fishing rod. It had a little hole in it that I stuffed the fiber through, but didn't turn with the axis of the spool. As a result, the fiber got twisted relative to the rotation of the spool, making a tight, strong string. I realized as I was making this that it didn't even have to be attached to the lathe. By putting it in the bottom of the spinning bowl, rotating with the cotton spinner, the arms of the spool would grab and collect the cotton into clumps on their surfaces, which would then grab onto any fibers already being drawn through the holes in the arms and would get pulled through themselves. This necessitated that I build a little guard around the spool to keep untwisted fibers from collecting on it accidentally. But in the end, I was really pleased with how automatic this mechanism was. As a final touch, I built a little brake pad into it such that when the spool is full, it'll apply a braking force to the entire system, grinding it to a halt so it doesn't get too full, and alerting me to when the spool needs to be changed. By that time, it was dark. I brought in the clay spinner parts and paper and set them by the fire to continue drying. I've got plenty of paper now, so I can set the pulp I made this morning aside for making cotton tomorrow. So far, I'm really pleased with both the systems I've come up with for making paper and cloth, specifically because they mean I waste absolutely nothing. Not one leaf, stem, or wood shaving from any of my construction projects, and I should be able to use pretty much any piece of plant, bark, duft, or driftwood to make more. Week 9, Day 2. After dinner, I brought in my foam mattress and tried it out. I'd almost forgotten how good a real mattress felt, as opposed to a whole bunch of grasses stuffed into a bag. For the first time in a while, I was starting to feel comfortable again, and I had the best night's sleep I've had since I got here. Life on this island is starting to get pretty cushy. After my morning chores, I pulled my spinner parts from the kiln and assembled the apparatus for testing, pouring in the cellulose goo that I had sitting overnight. It took a little tweaking to get right, but eventually I seemed to get it working properly and spinning the fibers into threads. Now I need to think about how I'm going to weave them, and I've already got some ideas from working with the mini loom yesterday. The principle of a loom is relatively simple. You have vertical threads, called the warp, tied to a frame, and you have the horizontal thread, called the weft, that goes through them. Normally, a loom uses a device called a shuttle that either passes between the alternated warp strings or zigzags through them, dragging the weft behind it. But the only way I could realistically do that under these conditions is by hand, which would take me forever. Naturally, I want something more automated. I had the idea that I could alternate the positions of the warp threads by tying half of them to one rectangular frame and half to another, alternating between them and hinged at the bottom, where the cloth is built up from. I could then simply drop the weft down between the warp threads, hinge the frame so the warp threads swap sides, and drop the weft down again. Easy. problem with this, though, is that when you try to alternate warp positions, the frames holding them get in the way of the weft, which is why they traditionally used a shuttle instead. But I want to avoid that. I spent some time throwing around different ideas. Strings held on the ends of long teeth, rollers, laying down the weft in different ways, but I kept coming back to the conclusion that I needed some way to make the threads physically swap from one frame to the other, which was going to be complicated. Nevertheless, I spent some time thinking about it and eventually arrived at a design that I think will work. The tops of the frames will have small pegs in them, to which each thread of the warp is tied. The threads will have little grooves on each end, and on the opposite side of the frame to the strings, there will be a bar with tapered slots on it, which will grab onto these grooves and hold the pegs in the frame. When the frames come together, the pegs will slide into their respective holes in each frame. Then the slot bars will be slid up or down, grabbing the pegs from the opposite frame and releasing the pegs on their home frame before the frames pull apart again. In this way, the warp threads will be able to alternate positions while still leaving an opening overhead for the weft. I took note of the fact that, with the pegs being so much wider than the threads, I'll also need to add a sort of comb that keeps the warp fibers packed together before splaying out to each peg. With a plan nailed down, I started working on this prototype. I cut down some bamboo and built the frames first, using bamboo joints of various sizes to make them hinge about a shared axle. This was relatively straightforward to build, and I had lunch when I was done, knowing the hard part lay ahead of me. Next, I started working on the peg holding mechanisms and slot bars, which I quickly realized would need to be stacked together in order to get the kind of thread count I wanted. This mechanism was going to need very high precision to work properly, because if the slot bar ever misses a peg, it's going to create inconsistencies in the weave. So before doing anything else, I made some jigs to ensure precise spacing and orientation when drilling the holes for the pegs and slots. For this part of the mechanism, I found I could use the hollow nature of bamboo to my advantage, making the slot bars basically half cylinders that could rotate coaxially about the shafts holding the threads, even having a counterpart on the backside of each shaft, so even if the front fails to grab a peg, the back won't. Conversely, to make sure each slot bar definitely lets go of their pegs at the same time, I made the open side of each slot extra large. I basically made these slots by drilling 2 holes of differing diameters, using my knife to carefully trim the intervening space away. Naturally, this took forever since I had to do it on literally thousands of holes. There was no way I was getting farther than drilling the first round of holes today, maybe about a quarter of the loom. I also needed to switch tasks periodically to avoid repetitive strain on my own body, and to make sure that all the parts worked together as intended. As the sun started going down, I assembled these mechanisms onto the loom frame I constructed so far, and tested to make sure it was working properly. It required operating the slot bars manually, but it seemed to be working correctly for the most part. Every now and then I also had to stop and unload the thread that the cotton spinner had been making, which I haven't really had any time today to deal with or put anywhere, so I would just stop, unload the reel, and leave it to pull on a shaft I put in the lathe and left running until the reel was completely unloaded, since I didn't have anywhere else to put the thread. When I needed the lathe to make pegs, I stopped and looked at the spaced wads of thread on the big reel, and got an idea for a change in the design of the loom. Instead of statically tying the string to each peg, I could have the frames swap whole reels of thread from one side to another. That way, if there was a larger reel at the bottom keeping tension on them, I could roll long swaths of fabric rather than a single sheet only as large as the frame. This is something to think about later, however, and shouldn't be too difficult to do. All I'd need would be to make the pegs a little longer and put guards on either end of them, which I was going to do anyway, to make sure the pegs never sink too deep into their holes. I just have to make them a little bit wider, and if each peg is about 1 centimeter in diameter, the threads only have to wrap around them 31 times or so to make a 1 meter long stretch of fabric. For the moment, I simply slid the wads of thread around and set them aside so I could collect more thread tomorrow, and used the lathe to trim a length of bamboo to a consistent diameter for the pegs, with various additional grooves so I could test the mechanism I'd built so far. Week 9, Day 3. Before I went to bed, I pulped another round of cellulose while I ate dinner. Then I went to sleep, a bit late, quite exhausted and with sore hands, but still pleased with my progress. After my morning chores and before getting back to work on the loom, I made an adjustment to the spinning reel, such that it would spin threads onto the pegs I built, so I can install them directly into the loom when it's finished. I'm about to spend the rest of the day repeating what I did yesterday, and just thinking about how much work that's going to be puts me off continuing. There has to be a better, faster way. I made an adjustment to my hole drilling jigs that allowed me to stack the bamboo rods on top of each other and drill down through them. As long as I took the drilling slowly and carefully, there wouldn't be a lot of distortion, and previous holes helped me keep the shaft straight. This allowed me to basically cut down my drilling time by a factor of 3. I found I could use a rougher piece of stone, like pumice, as a sort of Dremel on the drill press, which helped me cut down on the time it took to trim the edges of the slots. I was extremely pleased with all the time I saved myself, and before lunch, I assembled these new bars onto the loom and tested them. Honestly, the tolerances on the slots and holes are a little bigger now, but for the most part, it doesn't seem to be causing a lot of problems. Like I said, I designed the slot bars to be nearly glitch-proof. The problem I'm having now, though, is that the pegs on the hinged frame aren't meshing together so well, especially closer to the hinge, because the pegs are coming together at an angle when they need to be coming together head-on. This means I'll need to redesign the loom to work more like a press, which may have some problems meshing properly without some kind of guide on the corners, which would get in the way of the falling weft again. Can't change the taper of the pegs either, because the slot bars are designed to catch pegs of a specific size. The only other alternative is to trim the tops of the inside holes now to accommodate the altered angle of approach. I think that's going to be the least time-consuming option, especially with my new Dremel trick, but I'm not happy about having to take the loom apart and reprocess all the work I did yesterday. I spent the rest of the day after that finishing the construction and assembly of the various bars into the evening, and it seems to mostly work, but it's also driving home how complicated this project is. It looks like no loom I've ever seen, more like a pair of light brights being smashed together. I haven't even gotten to the guide combs yet, but I'm starting to think I may not need them. The frame is about 1 meter long and high, with about 30 pegs on each row, 3 centimeters of spacing for each peg, and the frame is about 1 meter high and has 30 rows. That's about 1,000 threads spread across 1 meter's worth of width, like I wanted. This will create a new problem, though, of the threads having to bend around the pegs on the lower levels. But because those pegs will always be held firmly in place, regardless of which frame they're on, or if they're between frames, this shouldn't be an issue. Might just cause a little loss of tension in some parts of the weave. It's been another long but productive day, if slightly spoiled by the need to backtrack. I'll start another load of cellulose grinding and soaking before having dinner and collapsing into my nice, soft bed. Week 9, Day 4. My loom is almost complete. After my morning chores, I spent a couple of hours lathing the pegs I needed, which was good because I was starting to run out of pegs to load into the spinner. The jig I built for this task the other day made it easy to really crank them out, though 1,000 was still a lot to do. Unfortunately, this wasn't the kind of problem I could just stack, though I felt like I learned an important lesson yesterday regardless. Next, I need to think about the shuttle. It needs to go back and forth across the warp, but also pull down to make sure the weft doesn't sit too high in the weave between cycles. A pendulum that simply drops string onto the warp would be easy to make, but wouldn't apply tension, and might catch the corners of the frame near the top. What I came up with in the end was sort of a big wheel or lever arm behind the frame, with a reel of thread sticking out from it a bit. By alternating this arm back and forth in time with the opening and closing of the frame, I can lay down the weft under tension across the warp before the pegs switch sides, and the pattern repeats. To drive the lever arm, I can attach it to a wheel and rod mechanism, kind of like the pistons on old-timey steam trains, which should result in the desired alternating action. From this, I should be able to drive the rest of the mechanisms of the loom as well. My thinking is that, when the shuttle arm comes down on either side of the loom, it'll push down on a lever that hinges the frames together. Alternatively, this could be done by a peg or cam on the drive wheel, whichever is mechanically strongest. At the same time, the lever arm will fall down on one side of the frame and pull on a lever or cord that actuates the slot bars on that side of the frame. This is another point at which the slot bars being circular will come in handy, because if they're rolling against each other like gears, half of them will roll up, locking the pegs of their row in place, and half of them will roll down, unlocking the pegs on their row. This will only work on one side of the frame at a time, the side with the shuttle arm on it. Unless, of course, I can connect the slot bars on each side to each other with a cord, using the hinge at the bottom of the framework like a pulley between them. Finally, to make the machine produce a continuous roll of fabric, I can tie the strings on the pegs to a wide reel on the hinge frame and attach a ratchet wheel to it, such that every time the frame closes and opens, it turns the ratchet wheel, maintaining tension on the warp, slowly unwinding the threads from the pegs until the reel is full. With all that figured out, I got to work, starting with the construction of the shuttle arm and drive mechanisms, which were actually pretty straightforward. Just a reel on the end of a stick, but I doubled it up so that there was an arm on both sides of the frame at once, to provide balance and prevent any undue bending of the arm, as it is quite long. I didn't really have any trouble making the alternating drive rod either. The ironic thing was that the hardest part to make was one of the simplest, that is, the drive wheel, since I only had bamboo to work with. At least I had a solution for it, and fell back on splitting a piece of bamboo, twisting it into a circle, and connecting it to the central shaft with spokes, like I did for the water wheel. Helped to soak the bamboo with water before twisting it. I finished the drive wheel later in the day and took a lunch break before moving on to modifying the slot bars, which wasn't difficult, just tedious because there are so many of them. This mostly involved tying pieces of cord to each slot bar and keeping them each under the same tension. I found that I needed to drill holes in certain places for the cords to tie into, and I just used my hand drill because I didn't want to disassemble the whole thing and haul each piece onto the drill press. Didn't need to make them that precise anyway. The hand drill's starting to look a bit worse for wear though, so that reminded me I need to make a new one, and I've got an idea in mind for that already. Next, I moved on to the fabric reel, which wasn't difficult to make at all. Just a piece of bamboo, split down the middle, and with the partitions carved out, so that when reassembled, it would rotate smoothly around the axis of the frame hinge. I also needed a ratchet wheel, but because it didn't need to be as strong as the drive wheel, and because I didn't want to spend a long time making it, I just took several short lengths of bamboo and ground one end of each on an angle, before affixing them to the reel with pegs and cord, beveled and in toward the center. In this way, I could make a couple of quick, simple ratchet wheels. A couple of loosely affixed pegs on the frame completed the reel. I realized at this point, though, that I would have to remove the axle from the frame regularly to remove the filled fabric reel, so I stopped and put a latch and hinge on it so it could swing out without me having to disassemble the frame to get at the finished fabric. The frame really only needs to hinge where the two halves come together anyway. At this point, I basically had everything but the drive wheel, and although it hadn't been more than a couple of hours, in my impatience, I decided to pull the rim out of the water early. It was a little bit softer, so I had an easier time at least bending it into a circle. I then attached the spokes, used some cord to hold the perimeter together, and sealed it up with latex so it would grab onto the power belt better. That reminded me that I hadn't built a separate belt for this mechanism, so I soaked a bundle of cords in latex and set it aside to dry. In the meantime, I can just use the dry belt from the lathe instead, not like I'm going to be using them at the same time anyway. I finally gave the machine a test, and as I anticipated with something this complicated, there were a lot of problems. The shuttle arms swung about wildly and the frames gnashed together like the jaws of some strange monster. But at least it was holding together, and I used cord to strengthen any joints that appeared to be weak. I also recognized at this point that it would be hard to tell whether the correct pegs were in the correct slots at a given time. So to make this easier on myself, I painted the ends of half of them with charcoal paste, and the ends of the other half of them with lime. If the machine is working properly, I should see a clear alternation between white and black on one side of the machine. If I see any mixing, it'll tell me that a peg is caught. There were plenty of small errors with these pegs, but I found that a little coconut oil went a long way to preventing bind-ups. I spent several hours just troubleshooting into the evening until the machine was working semi-reliably, and I found that it was kind of mesmerizing to just watch it go. At this point I had a fair amount of thread prepared, so I spent a couple of hours using the lathe to reel controlled amounts of it onto each peg. This was another one of those things that was taking too long, and I needed to find a better way to do it automatically. I started by splitting some bamboo and cutting the partitions out of it to create something for the pegs to sit in and rotate coaxially. Then I used the drill to put some holes in each peg, which I snugly secured a small stick into, binding them all together. I then connected the secured pegs to the lathe and let them rotate in it as a guide. I could fill one peg up until it started opening the guide, and then move the thread on to the next peg. When I was done, I just cut the thread connecting each peg, tying one end of the thread to each peg so it wouldn't come unraveled. With this mechanism, I was able to fill up about 10 pegs at once, but it's getting late now, so I should have dinner and go to bed, even though the fact that this project isn't quite finished will probably nag at me all night. Week 9, Day 5. I was eager to get the show on the road today, so after my morning chores, I finished machining and filing the pegs. I then installed them on the loom, which certainly took a while for all 1,000 pegs, tied them to the reel, loaded the shuttle, and tentatively started the loom up. I had to make a few running adjustments, especially when threads became tangled, but it soon seemed to be running smoothly. I took note of the fact that, the way I designed the shuttle to work, the fabric will always be closed on the sides due to the weft going back and forth, and open on the ends. Maybe that's why they traditionally put tassels on the two opposite ends of long rugs. This got me thinking, though, that if I want to be making clothes with this stuff eventually, I'm going to have to sew them together, and while I could do it by hand, that takes time, and what I've learned from this week is that I need to conserve time at all costs. I'm going to need to build some kind of sewing machine. I'm not done yet. This one's going to take some finesse. Fortunately, however, I've used a sewing machine enough times to understand how it works. More than a loom, to be sure. I think the lathe is halfway to being a sewing machine already. All I need is to build some fixtures into it to drive a needle up and down, though it's very much more complicated than that. The way a sewing machine works is twofold. First, the needle plunges a loop of thread down into the fabric. Then the bobbin underneath grabs the thread and passes it under and over itself. Along the way, this loop of thread grabs onto another piece of thread coming out of the bobbin and tries to drag it back up through the fabric. Tension and friction hold the threads together in the fabric, and the cycle repeats, creating stitching. With a rough idea of the parts I needed, I proceeded to carve a simple camshaft to attach to my lathe, with some guides to keep the needle straight, which I easily made with some of my larger fish bones. Not like I didn't have plenty of those lying around. The trick, though, was putting a hole in the fish bone near the tip that the thread could pass through freely without breaking the bone. The alternative was to have the hole really high up on the needle and plunge it very deeply into the fabric, which could cause damage or distortion to it. I played around with different designs, mostly breaking fish bones though, until I found a good middle ground, though I anticipated breaking many needles and used my drill press to build several of them. While I was at it, I realized it would be nice to have finer control of the sewing machine than just on or off via a belt. And while I could build brakes or speed transforming belts into the mechanism, I think it would just be easier for me to control the rotation by hand, or more accurately, by foot. I decided to add a foot pedal to the lathe mechanism. Again, this didn't take long to build. Just a shaft, a lever, some axles, and a few scrap pieces of bamboo tied together into a platform to press on, which easily attached to the lathe's frame. This, however, required me to first chip out a large amount of clay from the underside of the lathe to make room for it. At least the clay wasn't fired. It was basically just as soft as when I had to dig it out of the ground. I took a lunch break before moving on to the bobbin mechanism. I carefully carved a piece of bamboo into a little roller with a protrusion on it to hook the thread, as well as to catch the needle. My idea was that when the needle plunged down into the chamber containing the bobbin, it would push on the bobbin, causing it to turn halfway through the cycle. Then, as the needle retracted, pulling on the bobbin thread, it would drag the bobbin with it, completing the other half of the cycle. This one took some delicate carving. I built a mount for the bobbin and tried testing it out with the mechanisms I'd already built, but found that the thread loop kept getting tangled around the axle of the bobbin. So after scratching my head for a little while, realizing that the bobbin kind of has to float to let the thread pass around it, I got a couple more pieces of bamboo and used them to make some roller bearings to hold the bobbin in place, but also let it rotate freely and let the string wrap around it. The result was sort of a little box that the bobbin rested in, and I realized these bearings had the added benefit of rotating with the bobbin, so they'll help grab and drive the cloth through the machine as I sew. I ground some little teeth into them to help with this process. With the two key mechanisms of the sewing machine constructed, all I need to do now is chip out a space in the surface of the lathe to set the bobbin box in. By that time, I had a partial roll of fabric woven, even though I had to stop the loom every now and then to make adjustments. Even at its most anemic, the loom can lay down a thread of weft every 5 to 10 seconds, cranking out a whole square meter of fabric every 1.5 to 3 hours. I pulled the roll and examined the cloth. It was a coarse weave with occasional irregularities from pegs misbehaving, and a sort of beige color from the breakdown of materials in the varied plant samples I ground up to make it. But it is soft and breathes well. Infinitely better than the heavy Harakeke placemats I've been wearing the past 2 months. It makes me feel kind of ecstatic just touching it. It's just so perfect and regularly patterned compared to everything else I've made or found in nature up to this point. I never really thought about how manufactured items have a sort of beauty of their own until having been separated from them for so long. And on top of that, the inconsistencies make it kind of endearing, more closely resembling natural beauty, which has cracks and knots in it. That said, it also kind of pained me to think of cutting it up, but I had to do it, so I took my blades and carefully cut out the shapes for a tunic and trousers, taking measurements of myself first, and taking care not to let the edges of the fabric come unraveled. In spite of having sewn before, this was kind of the first time I've ever sewn anything this big, let alone on this kind of equipment. Nevertheless, my old knowledge served me well, and after a few running adjustments to make the sewing machine work just right, I managed to first hem the pieces I cut to make sure they wouldn't unravel as I manipulated them, as well as to help me get back into the groove of sewing, and then stitch them together into soft, comfortable clothes. I made the tunic long-sleeved in spite of the weather here, in order to keep the sun off my skin. Both the tunic and trousers are loose-fitting, however, so they push air around my body while I'm wearing them to help me keep cool. The only problem now, though, is that I have to be careful not to let these clothes get caught in my machinery. Loose clothing is a no-go around lathes. That was the most fabric I could make at the time, so I just got another set of cellulose ground and soaking in alkali, so I could make as much fabric in the near future as possible. It concerns me, though, how much firewood I'm going to need for all that line, so I'm going to keep tinkering with ways to replace wood as a source of heat. In the meantime, I made and spun as much cellulose goo as I could before the end of the day. Just before dinner in bed, I reloaded the loom and set it running overnight, hoping there wouldn't be any problems that would destroy it while I slept. But with that in mind, I made one more running adjustment to the loom, and that was to rest the lower roller in a vertical slot, such that if it came to the end of its available string, tension would build up and pull it off the ratchet wheels. The machine would keep running, but not tear the fabric if it runs out in the middle of the night. Week 9, Day 6. When I got up in the morning, I checked on the loom, which still made a few mistakes, but otherwise kept running through the night. After my morning chores, I made any necessary repairs or adjustments to the machine and started it running again. My plan for today was just to continue producing and stockpiling fabrics, so I'll have them later if I need them. Aside from going out to collect the cellulose products, this was at least relatively easy work. It's been raining a lot this week, which has been providing good power for the water wheel, but it also makes me wonder what I'll do if/when the dry season kicks in. I also had to keep the fire running hot all day to keep up with the demand for lime and potash, which was cutting into my wood supply. As such, I could only keep up with production for about 6 hours until I ran out of firewood, though by that time I produced and stockpiled about 10 square meters of fabric, which should do me for a while. At the end of the day, I used 2 square meters to make a sheet for my mattress, another 2 square meters to make a blanket, which I don't need in this climate but makes me feel cozy, and an additional 1 square meter to make a pillowcase, though I won't use all of it for that. The remainder I used to make a new backpack. I built it similarly to the old one, being functionally a cloth cylinder, but I also reinforced it with pieces of bamboo at the top and bottom rings, particularly weaving a solid wicker base for the bottom, cannibalizing parts from the old backpack to save time. The upside of this design over the old one, which was basically a basket I wore on my back, was that the fabric allowed it to collapse when not full, so it won't get in my way or catch on branches nearly as much. It still had the straps reaching over the top and back of the backpack to support the base, though through the top support ring, but I learned a few things from the old pack and crossed the support straps at the back so the pack will always sit evenly. I also added waist straps for additional supports and an oversized flap of cloth covering the top, with the inclusion of a couple of buttons to hold it closed. With the scraps I left over, I traced the shape of my hands and cut out some gloves, which have been sorely needed with all the handiwork I've been doing, though admittedly my hands have become quite calloused so far. I stitched them together and made a few adjustments to the hem so they would fit my fingers snugly. I've never had tailored gloves before. I wasn't done with them though, nor with the backpack, and before I had dinner, I mixed a couple of batches of rubber and coated both my backpack and gloves in it before leaving them to dry overnight. It occurred to me as I did this that I could theoretically make a diving suit this way, a project for way down the road maybe. Week 9, Day 7. I got to bed late. It's been a heavy work week and I was exhausted, but still very satisfied with what I'd made. It's my day off now, and boy is it well deserved this week. It was still raining a bit when I finished with my morning chores, but that was alright since I was planning to be inside most of the day anyway. The rain was getting annoying though, so I cut out 1 more square meter of fabric to make myself a rain poncho. Not exactly difficult work, and I generally enjoy sewing anyway. I soaked it in latex and, when I was done with it, I even added a little ground turmeric so it looked yellow, like a proper rain poncho. Today is for fun, science, and art after all. It's going to take forever to dry in this weather though, especially when I don't really have any fuel for a fire. All the wood I have is still wet. That is a situation I have to resolve soon, especially if I want to get into metallurgy someday. I have some ideas, but they aren't really worth pursuing until the weather improves, so I'll just have to keep them on the back burner. I needed something to do, so although it wasn't exactly rest-type work, I built that portable drill I put on my to-do list earlier, because it was something I could do in this weather. I took a short length of bamboo, split it, carved out the partitions, and tied it back together to basically function as the barrel of my power drill. I carved a new bow from a stick, this time taking more care to balance it properly, and used some bamboo cord for the string. I affixed this bow to the barrel and drilled some holes in the barrel to thread the drill shaft through. I used a smaller stick for the shaft, which I twisted the bowstring around, and then counterwrapped another piece of cord around it to act as a pull spring to wind up the drill. Finally, at the opposite end of the drill, I added a peg to widen the shaft, and a sort of notch in the barrel. By changing the tension on the cords holding the barrel together on that end, I can keep the drill in a charged state before letting it all go at once, or to control the speed of the drill by releasing tension slowly. I found this task wasn't too complicated, especially compared to building the loom last week, and it kind of feels marvelous that something like this has become simple to me. I also recognize, however, that it's kind of make work for me today. I stopped for a lunch break and started feeling bad again. Negative introspection. The heavy rain in particular reminded me of home, and I miss it. I find it so hard to rest because my mind starts tearing itself apart without something to do. This is nothing new for me, of course. I don't know how to live without an obsession. I think it comes from being on the autism spectrum. Or maybe it's just a big part of who I am. I think that's also a reason why I always found it so hard to relate to other people, because I could never understand how or why they could keep going or get anything done without some kind of ambition, some kind of end goal to drive them. I don't know how to live just for the sake of living, just for the sake of existing, and it seems like that's what a lot of people just seem to do. I don't get it. To keep myself from continuing to self-destruct, I decided to return to my chosen obsession, or at least some token reminder of it. I had some scraps left over from making the poncho, and with them, I went back to what I did the last time the obsession, the loneliness, and lack of a way out became too much. I started working on recreating my Yachty doll from back home, which I suppose requires some explanation. Why not? If I do get rescued, no one needs to see this, and if I don't, well, maybe at least this part of me will have a chance of not being completely forgotten. When I was young, I wanted to be an inventor and build robots, among other things. As I grew older and began to internalize Dad's vision for a multi-generational church, I created an imaginary character that I could practice being a dad for. Taking some inspiration from Astro Boy, I synthesized my two loves for science and theology, and imagined this character as an android, to whom I was creator as well as father. A little girl I named Yadidia, meaning beloved of God, or one who loves God, Hebrew, Yadi for short. This fantasy, if you want to call it that, enriched my life in ways I would have never predicted. I learned so much about how people work from trying to reverse engineer them, about how God thinks by inferring motive from design, how to be the best dad I could possibly be, and always looking for new ways to be better. I pretended reading the Bible to her every day, doing fun things with her, trying to explain grown-up events as they happened to me in a way that she could understand. She became my little imaginary shadow, someone to pour all my wisdom and pent-up affection into, a comfort when life got harder, and a reason to carry on when it got too hard to bear anymore. I made up my mind to try and build her for real someday. And as time went on, and I started to realize just how different I was, how alone I was in a world that couldn't understand my motives, nor I theirs, this seemed like an increasingly more realistic alternative to having biological children, though no less challenging. I became frustrated with every little thing that got in the way of that goal, that obsession. But in the meantime, I made a little cloth doll to continue practicing with, to remind me. As I started this whole process over from the beginning again, I told myself that this doll was not a replacement for the one I'd left back home. Just a symbol. Always was, really. For this one, I took my time, first drawing the outline and cutting out the shape of each body part, before sewing them together by hand rather than using the machine, which I kind of wish I'd done for the first doll. I took one piece of thread to the lab and soaked it in the copper sulfate solution collected from the mine to turn it a brilliant shade of blue for the eyes. Another thread I soaked in charcoal from the kilns to make the pupils. I went out in the rain and collected some pink leaf and ground it down to dye one more thread pinkish red for the mouth, being extra careful to let it dry so it wouldn't bleed. I also remembered that I needed to soak the thread in a mordant first, specifically potash, so the dye would stick to it. Thanks again, Rough Science. It started getting dark before the threads finished drying, especially since I decided to take my time with the stitching. But I wanted to be able to do this right. So I decided to put off sewing in the facial features until I have light to see by. I don't really have anything for stuffing yet anyway. Still, just having this little humanoid figure near me seems to simultaneously ease and intensify my loneliness, just as it did before. But I feel mostly better just having it near me. What I didn't mind making by lamplight was an outfit for the doll, so with the time I had left in the day, I cut the remaining scraps and stitched them together into a little patchwork dress for her. It kind of feels appropriate for the setting we're in. I had dinner, and then, as I tried to fall asleep, I thought about the situation I'm in. But nothing has really changed. The goal has always been the same. The obsession has not changed. My objective never changed. All that's happened is that I've hit a new delay in some ways, though perhaps, in others, an opportunity, since here I don't have to worry about my projects getting in anyone's way, or working 5 to 2 just to maintain my lifestyle in competition with other humans for resources. Still, that lifestyle and cooperation with other humans afforded me technical resources that I don't have access to here. So while I will try to do what I can here, to make the most of it while I have it, I must still take any opportunity I'm given to leave the island safely, or attract rescue. I think that change in perspective will help me start seeing the island not as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity to be used while I have it. I think that'll make life here a lot more bearable. And now for the bloopers. Probably due to the fluffier phloem, I spent some time practicing removing the fire. Whew. Because though, but be pugs? Here there be pugs. Ah! How bad is the audio quality if I leave the door open? How good is the audio quality when I leave the door closed? The frame really only needs to hinge where the two halves come together anyway, Oh, it's hard to breathe. I need oxygen. Then I used the drill to put some holes in each peg, which I snugly secured a small stick to. Another tongue twister. The way a sewing machine works is twofold. I think it would just be... No, I said that already. Santa Lucia, Santa Lucia. Oh, that helped clear out my throat a little. Which was... Which. I feel like I should say something more. Hey there. Thanks for listening all the way to the end. Well, I guess this is it. My biggest, weirdest secret is out there on the internet. I want to build robot children. At least now that everyone knows, I guess that means I don't have anything else to hide, and can't hide it anymore even if I wanted to. So, I might as well just be myself from now on. So, if you like this and I didn't scare you away with TMI, you can press the like and subscribe buttons, and the bell button will let you know when I start my next project. Even if you didn't like it, every little bit helps the algorithm find other folks who would, so I appreciate you watching this far. I'm willing to bet that I'm not the only one who feels this way, though. Kind of the whole reason I started this series. So, if my story sparked something in you that reminded you of yourself, or if you just want to chat about the textile and tailoring projects from this week, which I also find pretty cool, and any of your own projects that this reminded you of, please leave a comment. I really do want to hear your stories and strike up a conversation. With all that said, as always, thank you so much just for listening, and I look forward to seeing you here again next week.